My most vivid memories are probably in high school. And I remember being in science class next to this boy. He had like curly blonde hair, and he would always make comments at me like, why don't you go outside and go pick cotton? Or, these very like racialized comments.
I was 4 years old, my first day of kindergarten, when I told my dad, when he was picking me up for my first day of kindergarten, I told him to never call me Junior or Jorge again, that my new name was George. And I told him to never speak Mayan to me, never speak Spanish to me. I remember just being so angry, and I had no idea why. I don't know even what happened that first day of school.
There was no messages that came to me that I was as good. So I didn't want to be the brown girl anymore. I wanted to be the white girl.
Traditional public schooling with Eurocentric curriculum and practices ignores, erases, and even criminalizes students of color from historically racialized and marginalized communities. These experiences are all too common.
I went to a middle school where, at a time where if we had a break time, a brunch or lunch, we could not congregate in groups of 5 or more students because that would be considered a gang. And we'd literally have principals and teachers who that was their job during the break. They would just walk around and tell us, hey, that's a group of 6. You guys need to break up to 2 groups of 3.
I write about this a lot, but just needing to become invisible, and to hide my culture, hide my language, being embarrassed of my family's accents, all of the pieces. And now being in teacher ed and having a deeper understanding of ethnic studies, I can see how much of that was because of sort of my colonial experiences with schooling and what I internalized and what I took away, and all of that rooted in the idea of not feeling good enough.
When we take a look at students with a reported race during the 2019-2020 school year in California public schools, 77% of students enrolled were students of color. Of the students who dropped out that year, 81% were students of color. These statistics call for an interrogation of current educational practices, curriculum, and teacher preparation.
That's the internalized oppression, right? Or the interpersonal oppression. You believe this idea that first and foremost, white people are superior.
Schooling begins to operate on their bodies and minds and spirits at a very young age. I've seen this so many times experientially as a father, seeing my kids in many ways suffer as brown children, going through the schooling system, my young daughter being othered, and then the layers of complexity. Even though there's a Latina teacher, like, she still got these Eurocentric ideas of what it means to learn, starts labeling them.
Teachers have an impact in identity formation processes, whether they like it or not. And unfortunately, the way that the system is set up, it impacts students negatively.
As a longtime public school educator, I have noticed how students experience racialized identities in school created by the traditional Eurocentric curriculum used and the teachers who teach it, ultimately impacting their learning and their overall sense of self.
Many times for students, our first recollection of knowing where we are placed, on race and racial hierarchies and those sorts of things is in the classroom.
Students learn about, white dominant culture through everything that we've been teaching them, through the history books that currently exist and the textbooks and what's highlighted, the ways that we have structured our classrooms. I mean, the whole idea of raising our hands and, bells and, non-cooperative learning. I mean, those are all strategies that continue to perpetuate white supremacy culture, this whole idea of individualism.
The curriculum, from what I see, also having a 3rd and 4th grade child, it is just nowhere near ethnic studies. I mean, we're doing social studies weekly, we're celebrating Colonial Day, you know, like there's a tiny bit of effort to be more inclusive, but there's nothing about Black Lives Matter. There's no talk of Indigenous Day. You know, even simple ways of honoring other folks' community, it's not happening.
The traditional curriculum is incredibly harmful to Indigenous students, Black students, students of color.
When they're forced to learn a Eurocentric curriculum that is based on the idea that people of color don't have much intellectual knowledge. And so if you're a teacher teaching a Eurocentric curriculum, you kind of have these built-in assumptions that the BIPOC students in front of you come from traditions that are not intellectually rich traditions, and therefore those kids are also not intellectually rich and not strongly intellectually capable. And that you see a lot. And that's a huge form of violence on students that I think does huge damage.
Educational programs such as bilingual education and multicultural education have attempted to counter the negative impact Eurocentric curriculum has had on students of color.
So there was components of it that were multicultural, where we did have bilingual classes, where we did have different cultural events that would be introduced to us. It was only as a way to help us integrate into the mainstream curriculum that the school is offering.
So I think that's where folks get the idea of multiculturalism and ethnic studies mixed up, is that multiculturalism kind of is this all, right? Like, let's celebrate it all. Whereas ethnic studies says, no, let's really dig into these particular communities and their experiences.
If our multicultural education is not helping children to recognize the way in which systems and society, even young children, are perpetuating white supremacy, then we're just teaching students to accept the system as it is. Multicultural education, in most of the forms we see in schooling, is far from helpful, and actually it's usually harmful, because it teaches students, see, here's all these, different people, and we all just think differently, and the system itself is fine, there's nothing wrong with it. The school to prison pipeline doesn't exist. Racial disparities in healthcare doesn't exist. The COVID disparities we see didn't exist, they didn't happen. It erases those inequities. And so it teaches children that not only that they should be disempowered, but society is fine the way it is, and anything you see wrong in communities of color, it's their fault, right? So it's a really violent tool. The weak forms of multicultural education that exist out there actually perpetuate the violence of white supremacy.
If we truly want justice for all, we must provide students with an education that develops them as critical thinkers who analyze their realities and who are then willing to transform the world around them. Education researchers have recognized ethnic studies as vital to increasing student success. I wondered why and how ethnic studies could have such a positive impact on students, so I reached out to ethnic studies educators to get some answers.
Ethnic studies, critical or liberated ethnic studies, actually teaches children to understand ways in which to change the system for liberation, for equity and equality both, not just give everyone the same thing, right? It helps students understand that our systems literally structure inequity to keep the hierarchy of white supremacy intact.
When we're talking about ethnic studies, we are centering race.
To be inclusive of the students that we have in our classrooms that for too long have been overlooked and erased from the curriculum and the story of this country.
By centering histories and current realities of communities of color, ethnic studies provides students with the space to develop self-determination, strong cultural identities, re-engage them in school, and increase academic achievement. But how is ethnic studies defined?
We have to teach the truth. Our students deserve to know the truth. And from that, I believe we can, there's a lot of liberation, freedom that can happen. And the truth is love, right? And with that comes healing. And when you consider what we're going through, if you look at our political climate, you look at our classrooms, our communities right now, we are hungry and desperate for healing, for truth, and for love. And that's what ethnic studies is.
When I think of ethnic studies, I think empowerment, truth, and knowledge, but also I think of love, because through ethnic studies, so many of us learn to not only love ourselves and our stories, but with that, we learn to love everyone else's. And that's what builds solidarity in our communities.
Ethnic studies is the only answer to us collectively moving forward as a society.
Tú eres mi otro yo. You are my other me. Si te hago daño a ti, if I do harm to you, me hago daño a mí mismo. I do harm to myself. Si te amo y respeto, if I love and respect you, me amo y respeto yo. I love and respect myself.
¿Se puede?
Sí se puede.
¿Se puede?
Sí se puede.
¿Se puede?
Sí se puede. Adelante.
We can't really become ourselves unless we have deep roots, right? And that's what ethnic studies helps us with, is with our roots.
Ethnic studies it empowers us. It allows us to go deeper than just, what we're gonna do in our career, or what we're gonna do as a job, or what our responsibilities are as citizens, or as members of a community. But it's more like our responsibility to our ancestors, our responsibility to a global world community.
To help students build foundational knowledge based on truth, love, and solidarity, educators need to purposely use an ethnic studies framework to ensure the curriculum moves beyond diversity and inclusion to criticality and humanization.
We are looking at who are we centering. So in conversations, again, depending on the grade level, depending on what the topic is, how are we centering our African American community, our Latinx, Chicanx community? How are we centering our Native American community or our Asian American community?
It has to be framed in the context of people of color, which is a framework that we use in the United States. It's different from all the other parts of the world. And that's why ethnic studies has to be based in the United States. It can have transnational relationships and histories, of course, like migration histories from other parts of the world, but it has to connect to the American experience. Students have to be analyzing real world scenarios and comparing history with the present. If the teacher is only teaching them about histories of the past, then that's not fully ethnic studies.
Also focus on the beautiful culture and the stories that are connected to BIPOC people, because our stories don't just start with the culture of white supremacy. We have to go back to the truth about people's communities and to tell their history through their eyes, not through the eyes of colonization.
California has already approved Assembly Bill 101, making ethnic studies a required graduation course for all high school students. However, I feel that we need to take a closer look at how ethnic studies can be implemented in elementary school, because students as early as preschool are impacted by Eurocentric curriculum, Euro-dominant pedagogy, and a racialized society.
Ethnic studies for young children is scholarly, it's academic for them. They're learning reading and writing skills, they're learning listening and speaking skills. It's very easy to incorporate math and science into it.
In elementary school, students come to school full of wonder. They ask questions and seek answers. They want to be fair, kind, and they want to learn and grow to make the world a better place. My own experience as an elementary teacher and elementary school principal has led me to believe that it's possible to start ethnic studies earlier than high school.
We know from research that young kids as early as age 3 see differences and are curious about differences. And we also know that very often their parents, and especially white parents, will tell them, oh, it's not polite to ask about that. And so white parents particularly will shut down questions. Parents of color are much less likely to do that. But kids come into the classroom with questions and with things that they want to know about.
How can schools and educators support students when they ask questions about differences? Should we continue to ignore and avoid critical and sometimes difficult topics with young students? Or should we take initiative and tackle topics that our young students many times already have opinions on?
The hard and the hard work for elementary teachers is to figure out what that pedagogical mediation means. In other words, not to say we can't do this, but how it is, for example, through children's books. Can we explore racial capitalism and not shy away from it as something that like only high school students are prepared to take on? Because that's the other critique I've heard. Children are not ready for this. And already think about what I said. That's a deficit, completely deficit framing of children.
The success and impact of ethnic studies does not only depend on the content included in the lessons taught and the instructional practices used in the classroom. Its success also depends on what teachers believe about students' cultural and academic capacities and students' overall ability to understand society and their role in it.
I do not believe that elementary school students are too young because I taught elementary school students about race and ethnicity in my classrooms. They are a lot more aware than we give them credit for.
They understand what's fair, what's not fair. They understand difference. They understand similarities.
The thing about young people is that they're also honest and they're also willing to understand truth. And that is why it is so important to teach ethnic studies at the elementary level.
With or without that space within a school, they are going to have their conversations, but what will they take away? What will they learn? And what will they internalize?
Elementary educators who believe students can handle talking about the story of this nation, its history, and the direct impact on how society works now, also know that the content presented needs to be age appropriate, making elementary age students never too young to talk about the truth.
We're doing them a disservice by not talking about it. It is actually our responsibility as educators to create the academic space for them to engage in critical conversations, to provide them with the vocabulary so that they can articulate their thoughts and feelings. It is our responsibility to create the academic environment so that they can take those academic risks and that they can explore. Otherwise, by not talking about it, we are telling them that that's not important and that it doesn't matter.
Because if we keep this whole topic of race as like being taboo and not being appropriate for them, we're lying to them.
We can tell by the way people interact in our communities what cultures are appreciated and maybe others that are not. So students don't live in a bubble, and elementary students as young as kindergarten are already exhibiting signs of the different isms, racism, sexism, and even xenophobia. I've seen it as young as pre-K. So this is important for us to discuss this in the classroom settings. Students are not too young to understand race.
We're not preparing them to create systemic change. We're not preparing them to engage civically. We're not preparing them to end racism or bigotry or sexism or any of the other isms by not talking about these things.
If we enter into ethnic studies as a really young age, that process of unlearning that so many of us have to go through as adults or high school students wouldn't have to happen. The learning would happen centering ideas like identity and community and transformation, key themes in ethnic studies. And young children, they're ready for that. They understand. I feel like young children understand humanity better than we do as adults. So if we can get into deep work and challenge students to, at a young age, to have, a strong analysis of themselves and the world around them, the world would look, in my mind, like very different.
Ethnic studies in elementary school helps students develop as critical thinkers and increases civic engagement. But how exactly are ethnic studies lessons developed and taught at the elementary level?
The ethnic studies curriculum, right? That's the content that we teach. So whether you're teaching math, language arts, social studies, science, right? There's ways to integrate ethnic studies into the curriculum.
I like to always start my science during the year with connections to the land and connections with our native roots for 4th and 5th graders. And since both of them in our social studies standards has to start off with who are our native people in the surrounding area and in our nation, I have a tendency to use that opportunity to also include the science as well. So what I did was I read several books. I read books like Water Protectors that have a connection to who are the people, who are their connections to their land, and why they have that strong connection, that feeling of caretaking. And then we start taking a look at our plant and air ecosystems. And then so we start looking at that because those are both the standards of 5th grade and a little bit in the land, plant and animal structures is the standards in 4th grade. So I use the combination of those two to bring out a Native perspective for social studies.
I would have my 2nd grade students write letters, utilize their persuasive writing and informative writing skills to write research letters to the Bureau of Indian Affairs and send those letters advocating for the Ohlone peoples to become federally recognized. And they would also reach out to the local indigenous tribes, ask them to be our guest speakers, and then ask them, how do we help you? How can we stand in solidarity with you?
For example, if you're going to teach Black studies, right? You can't have a story about the Black experience that's written by someone who's non-Black. It didn't matter what we were studying. My goal was to choose literature and choose things that we were reading that was told from a first-person narrative.
For young children, though, Soul Way is a book that we've used where a little girl goes, tells the story of her experience in trying to lighten her skin and being teased at school for having darker skin than her siblings. And so I think through reading those stories, children can think about their own experiences related to colorism. However, this is the part we really have to think about that we're decolonizing. We leave it at that, then it looks like students of color, violence against students of color. But the fact is colorism serves white people the most, right? Because my skin is the lightest, right? So I get the most benefit from it. We can't skip that step. And that's the most important piece, is that we don't shy away from that systemic critique that ethnic studies ensures that what you're doing is not just multicultural education, but it is ethnic studies. So when you say colorism helps white people the most after you read the story, young children can understand that. And then you ask them in the classroom, hey, let us know when you're seeing colorism, right? This isn't something that is okay in our classroom. It's just like name calling. We talk about colorism when we see it in a book, when we see it in a movie, when we hear it on the playground, right? It's something we name and we say is not okay, and then we talk about how we're all beautiful.
So you're constantly developing curriculum that includes what's happening in the community, right? You're not just going to skip over current events or something that's touching your students and touching their families and act like it doesn't exist.
Besides integrating ethnic studies curriculum that is culturally responsive and directly relevant to students' histories and their lived experiences within all subjects in elementary, educators must include ethnic studies pedagogy.
Regardless of what you're teaching, all educators have pedagogical practices, right? You have your methods, how you teach students, especially for ethnic studies, like how are you creating a space for students to kind of drive the learning, to use their own inquiry, to create projects, to go out into the community, to look around at their surroundings and, and actually kind of tackle those issues that matter to them.
At the elementary level, it is super important to make connections with those families, to invite them into the classroom, even as guest speakers. Come and talk about your traditions, come and talk about your travels, talk about what if you migrated here, talk about what your home country was like. Come in and teach the students something, just make those connections so that that cultural wealth is being encouraged and brought into the classroom, because that again is allowing students to see their parents as educators, see their parents as having something to offer, that knowledge isn't just coming from the teacher in the classroom and the textbooks, but that it also comes from their own families, that they bring cultural wealth into the classroom and that they can see themselves and their families as having something to offer as well.
When educators recognize and include community cultural wealth, they are focusing on the cultural assets and richness that students of color bring from their homes and communities into the classroom. It is through this practice that students of color become visible and are nurtured and empowered.
The parents themselves are doing ethnic studies in the home without calling it ethnic studies. They were doing it through the ways in which they built community. They were doing it through the ways in which they brought their own oral histories. Talking about abuelitas, abuelitos, this endogenous, beautiful ancestral knowledge that is present in the home, the convivencia, sometimes the regaños and consejos. These are just as examples of ethnic studies work in the home. They're living and breathing these principles of decolonization, of criticality, of storytelling, and ultimately I would say of love, if love is something that's at the center of ethnic studies pedagogies.
When working with students of color, educators should not only create spaces in the classroom where students could bring in their experiences and knowledge, but educators should also commit themselves to learning about the students and the community they serve, understand how race and racism impacts their students, and use that knowledge to support them.
The teacher needs to know how to talk about very delicate subject matter in a way that doesn't re-traumatize students, in a way that we can utilize student experience, especially the tough ones, the tough experiences, and utilize that as points of liftoff for powerful conversations.
As a teacher of color, I might have had more similar experiences to that of my students. But let's just say I'm not a teacher of color, I'm a white teacher, and my experience was different. When a student of color shares something, can I affirm that? Can I ask more about it? Can you say more? Or do you somehow dismiss it because that's not, white mainstream, dominant culture?
I don't think an ethnic studies teacher can call themselves an ethnic studies pedagogue if they don't know how to translate their own humanity into an experience of love and rigor for the students. The teacher must view themselves as a facilitator. They cannot be one that regurgitates information and expects the students to regurgitate it back. It also has to be a place where students are constructing knowledge.
Pedagogy to me is like the lens in which we see our teaching. And that oftentimes includes the sort of second-to-second decisions we make as educators, or what we decide to put on the walls, or how we talk to our students, or how we engage with our communities and build on the assets of our students' families.
It is about the experiences that we as educators provide, design, implement, facilitate, whatever verb you want to use, but it's the conditions that we create in our classrooms and our schools.
Ethnic studies also needs to live beyond the four walls of the classroom. Not only do educators need to affirm and be responsive to students' history, culture, and community wealth inside the classroom, but also need to take the learning outside of the classroom and be community responsive, making ethnic studies lessons different from school to school and city to city.
Last but not least, but ethnic studies has to leave the classroom. An ethnic studies, if you're doing your job as an ethnic studies teacher, ethnic studies is going to leave the classroom. It's going to lead to civic engagement. It's going to lead towards this student-led inquiry with their own family, with their own community, right? That starts to take action.
Using ethnic studies curriculum that is culturally and community responsive, coupled with pedagogy that focuses on community cultural wealth, love, and facilitation, develops students who become agents of their own learning, and the impact on their cultural and scholarly identities is immediately visible.
The best impact for ethnic studies, when I start seeing my kids wanting to help other people, when I start seeing my kids feeling good about themselves and celebrating who they are.
I have seen students who didn't really want to do much writing really step it up after ethnic studies lessons because they have so much to say. And I've also seen students continue teaching after they learn ethnic studies lessons, because many times, because so many other educators are not doing those lessons, I tell students, like, why don't you go share your information? Because I have this term I use with them, each one teach one. So every time they learn something, I'm like, go teach someone something you learned, so more people know this truth.
One thing that's not talked about enough is that ethnic studies can even benefit some students who it's not really intended to benefit, right? Students who are not necessarily part of the course content that we'd be covering in an ethnic studies class.
When you explicitly talk about race and anti-racism, you have a huge impact, not just on students of color at the elementary grade level, but white students as well. And actually the impact is even more positive for racial attitudes for white students at the elementary level, probably because they have farther to go, right? Students of color are very aware of racism at a young age, whereas white students are sort of oblivious. They assume that no one's racist, that no one's being unkind to children. You know, racism is so ingrained in our society, it's like the air we breathe, right? But students of color are very aware of it. So white students, when they start to talk about this and, you know, they recognize that it's real, they are like, oh, wow, this is really important. I want to be fair. I want to be kind to everyone. I really didn't know this existed. This experience was happening for my peers.
Ethnic studies educators are not born. They are made when they are willing to take a deeper look at themselves and their role in a racialized society. It is through the process of unlearning Euro-dominant ways that educators can unapologetically commit to challenging the status quo in the classroom and in their own community.
If I was never introduced to ethnic studies, I wouldn't have continued higher education. I wouldn't have continued interest in higher education. I wouldn't be teaching at community college. I think if there was no ethnic studies, personally, I would have been someone who would just work to survive.
That realization, I so wish I would have had it in kindergarten. And that's why it's so important that we push ethnic studies, because I think of what that would have done for me in kindergarten and all of the adversity that I dealt with growing up, how knowing that identity young, it would have made such a difference.
What would it mean for my Asian students to experience that awakening for themselves? My Black students, my Indigenous students, my Latino students. And so that was life-changing for me. And that's what I wanted to replicate in the classroom. If I had that experience as a student myself, as a second grade student, I don't even know what I would have been by now. You know, I don't know what the possibilities could have been, but I think I would have had far more options, far more than what I had then.
But when I found ethnic studies, or maybe ethnic studies found me, it gave me that purpose for teaching, for who I was, because I didn't want then my own son and then my students to have to go through this identity crisis that I went through. So everything that I did as a kindergarten, first grade teacher, as an assistant principal, and even now in my position, affirming identity is paramount.
When I did my teacher credential program, also at UC Santa Barbara, I had a Black woman professor who taught the diversity course. And that was for the first time that I was able to hear and unpack some of what I had been learning and internalizing this whole time. And it was at that like pivotal moment with her that I could begin to like unlearn.
Though ethnic studies can have a positive impact on students and educators alike, it does not come without challenges that have delayed the implementation of ethnic studies in public schools, especially in elementary schools.
Folks are thinking of it as just the content, just the curriculum. So let's get, an ethnic studies books in the class, and this is where you talk about, particular concepts, and that checks the box. As opposed to really looking at ethnic studies content and ethnic studies pedagogy, going hand in hand.
The lack of curricula. When I first started becoming an ethnic studies teacher, I had to spend 50 hours to create one unit. Immense amount of research.
You have to be able to go through your own experiences, your racialized identity, understanding your positionality, how you show up in a space, what the impacts and the effects of that are in the classroom with your students, right? Whether you're a white male, white female, right? American Indian, Alaskan Native teacher teaching, primarily Black students, right? Like, you have to understand all of those dynamics. And a lot of our educators just haven't had an opportunity to do that or the time to do that.
Educators who are already in the classroom have challenges specific to implementing both the curriculum and pedagogy. Challenges with having the time needed to plan an ethnic studies lesson, and the challenge of having the space to do the inner work needed to become an ethnic studies educator while already doing everything else educators do to teach. But the challenges do not end there.
We are at a crossroads because ethnic studies has been approved as a graduation requirement for the state, and we're fast approaching that date at which all schools are expected to offer ethnic studies programs and make it that requirement. And we know full well that we don't have enough teachers to be able to fill those positions.
Now you still have a system, right? Who gets to teach it? Who's credentialed to teach it?
I have a student who did a major and has a master's in Chicano studies. And yet that is not enough for her to get a ethnic studies credential, even after finishing all the teacher ed coursework.
There's ethnic studies pedagogy certificates. We've created one in our institution. Hopefully we have a credential. When the credential gets created, I think the problem is the state itself won't know what to do with elementary because it's going to be a single subject credential. So we need an authorization. In other words, we need state support to define and nudge us along so that the elementary teachers are saying they're not ready. I think one, they need preparation, and then they can ask that question. I really believe if they go through an experience of ethnic studies themselves, they're going to think with those lenses as tools rather than resist them. Because a large part is, they're probably not prepared to undertake this work.
So how do we prepare elementary educators to teach ethnic studies? The state, along with teacher education programs, need to start thinking about how to offer ethnic studies credentialing programs at all levels, K through 12, without losing the integrity of real ethnic studies curriculum and pedagogy.
A lot of institutions are trying to do, quickly have ethnic studies in their teacher ed program and do this sort of work that's really transactional, not transformational. And that's problematic because ethnic studies is something that's deeply tied to a lot of processes and thinking and community and critical thinking, and it's not something that someone can just quickly learn.
You have educators who are a product of this system that didn't teach them about themselves or others. And we have our teacher preparation programs that don't prepare teachers to teach ethnic studies. And so even when you have the support where you have teachers saying, yes, I want to do this, I see the value in it, they still don't know how.
In addition to the challenges current ethnic studies educators face with implementing ethnic studies in schools, and the needed credentialing and training for pre-service educators in teacher preparation programs, ethnic studies also faces challenges in the community.
Our own education about ourselves gets politicized. And then who has the political power? Who has the political power to say, we're going to do this anyways? And who has the political power to say, no, you're not?
Even 50 years after the founding of ethnic studies, there's still been limited implementation of ethnic studies at the lower levels, at the elementary school levels, I should say, because ethnic studies grew out of a political movement. And I think there are still school districts and administrators and school board members who see it as essentially a political project, or who see it as dangerous or controversial. And in the great desire to avoid conflict and controversy, I think those folks have taken a wide berth around ethnic studies. You don't have to imagine, you just look at the record, how difficult it has been to implement any real kind of critical reforms in curriculum. They're met often with hostility and opposition from, I would argue, mostly outside groups, outside organizations, who then foment, parent outrage, and then you get school board meetings where you have, viral moments. In today's time, somebody will cry at the podium saying, my daughter is upset because she feels bad about being white.
This idea of indoctrination, right? We're not indoctrinating children. We're just challenging them to ask questions and to look at things differently.
There's a lot of pushback. If you're teaching ethnic studies, you're teaching our students of color to hate white people, that it's anti-American, that you're teaching white kids to feel bad about themselves, right? And all lies, and more lies. Misconceptions that get spread, unfortunately, very widely, quickly.
Though these challenges are present and slowing down the implementation of ethnic studies statewide, individual educators can join in on the collective grassroots efforts that has kept ethnic studies alive for more than 50 years. Start by looking for educators and other co-conspirators around you who believe in the power of ethnic studies.
Come together and say, look, within a school district, if there's 5 out of 10 of you that really want ethnic studies, that means something versus 1 out of 10 of you. And so really finding the folks that you're aligned with.
Connect with other ethnic studies educators. We are always the ones who help one another, who teach one another, because we have so much information and we need to share it with one another. The best thing would be to start building your community of ethnic studies educators.
Parents play a real pivotal role in all of this. And so a lot of the districts that are fighting for ethnic studies have also a strong parent community that are fighting with them.
If there is a need to look beyond those educators and parents who are around you, don't be afraid to reach out to the ethnic studies experts.
Seek out organizations, universities that are really promoting real ethnic studies.
It is imperative that you have enough humility to say, we need help, and reach out to the experts, and the experts not being a consulting firm that is made up of all white folks who have never been in a classroom.
Educators can continue to advocate for ethnic studies so all students could have access to the curriculum and pedagogy.
To really keep the ethnic studies movement moving forward in California and the United States and worldwide, we need to advocate for ethnic studies as ethnic studies educators. We need to do more than just teach a lesson. We need to advocate it in our community, in our school settings, in our district. We also need to challenge our colleagues and have those uncomfortable discussions on why don't you want to teach ethnic studies? Why don't you see the value in it? Those challenging conversations that, while we're simultaneously building community with those colleagues, is how we're going to keep moving this forward.
There is so much more educators can do to push ethnic studies forward in elementary school. But what about state legislation? Is there a need for legislation that will make ethnic studies a requirement at the elementary level so it can continue to exist and grow?
I'd like to see a national movement for ethnic studies, but the reality is ethnic studies started at the grassroots level. We already have legislation that has now made ethnic studies a graduation requirement for high school, but legislation is not what's going to get it done. To do this work in a real meaningful way, it should be at the grassroots level.
All students deserve to see themselves in their education, and through ethnic studies, they will not only get to be seen, affirmed, and heard, but they will be able to see, affirm, and hear others. All it takes is for educators to heed the call.
As educators in our community, we have a moral and ethical responsibility to teach the truth. And if we want to see a difference, then we have to be different as educators, and we need to start teaching our students from the moment they come into our classroom. Regardless of how old they are, there's age-appropriate lessons. And by not teaching ethnic studies, we are withholding truths from our students. By not teaching ethnic studies, we are doing them a disservice. We have to be brave and courageous and do what's right for our students. We have to do what's right. And if you are a leader in this time, you're called to do what is right and to teach the truth.